how many folks we have here, or what percentage of you that are here are parents or grandparents of a creative, sensitive, and or gifted teen. How many of you are teachers, or how many of you are here because of some other role or relationship to creative, sensitive, and gifted teens. So we have teachers and grandparents and others. So great, that's very helpful. And then I would like to also know, so 50% of us on the line are parents and grandparents. Well, we allowed you all to choose more than one answer, so we've got more than 100%, by the way, interestingly enough. 50% parent, grandparent, 50% other, and 25% teacher. So that helps me. If those of you who are, click the other, if you could put something in the chat, if you could type something in the chat window that would describe your connection to gifted and creative and sensitive teens, that would help me. And if you would type something that would speak to your connection, so that I can speak to you and your specific needs, that would be very helpful. And then while you're doing that, there's another poll that I want to launch. I'm going to close that poll. I guess I have to close that one before I can launch another one. And wondering, what kind of concerns do you have about teen suicide? Do you know somebody who's had a teen suicide in their family? And if you know someone who has had a suicide attempt, that would be fine to include that there as well. Do you have concerns about a student of yours? The next one's a child of yours, or about someone else that you know. So that would be helpful if you can answer those questions. And looks like we've got about 50% of the votes in so far, and 75% now are in. And so 60% know someone who's had a teen suicide or suicide attempt in their family. 33% have concerns about a student of yours, and again, I allowed you to choose more than one answer. 67% have concerns about someone that you know. So that's very helpful for me to have. And again, if you have any specific questions or concerns that you would like to see addressed tonight, feel free to put them in the chat window that should be on the right side of your screen. This is the same presentation that I gave this afternoon. The Douglas County, Colorado School District has what they call Parent University. And so this topic originally, and this presentation was made for their PowerPoint, or their program, which happened earlier today in a live event. And I knew that since that was during the day, that there would be parents and others that might want to attend that were not able to come during the day. So that's why I have planned this for this evening. So we may have folks from here, and we may have folks from elsewhere around the country or even around the world, and I'm happy that you're all here. And some folks will be attending by through the recorded program as well. I'm Sharon Barnes. I'm a therapist for sensitive and gifted, and my website's there on the bottom of your screen, therapistforsensitiveandgifted.com, and feel free to go there for any other resources that we have. My first introduction to suicide was growing up in the home of a pastor, and sitting in the living room one evening as I was a child, and I remember it being dark out, and my mother and I were sitting there looking out the front window, and we were waiting for my father to come home. He had gone to the home of one of our parishioners to be of help and support, because the wife and mother, the woman of the family, had laid down on the railroad tracks intending to passively commit suicide. Fortunately, that did not happen, but that was my introduction of watching my parents be support to people who were in um, who had suicidal thoughts and made suicide attempts. Clearly, I've gone on to get training in the mental health field, and I have worked on an inpatient psychiatric unit. I've had an outpatient counseling psychotherapy practice for over 20 years, and I have worked in intensive care units where people who have attempted suicide have been cared for. And I have supported families of people who have have completed a suicide. So that's kind of my background in that. And of course, in my outpatient private practice, I have made many assessments. I have asked people questions many times to assess, did I need to send them to the emergency room? How close were they? How much danger were they in? And I know that's the concerns of a lot of you that are here with us tonight, of how much danger are the folks that you care about in. And of course, that's one of the things that we're going to talk about this evening. And hopefully you will have tools to help you um, with that. But first, let's talk about the scope of the problem. How big of a problem is this? Well, and I only have statistics for the United States and for the state of Colorado here. In the United States, suicide is the third leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 24, so tweeners, teenagers, and young adults. In Colorado, suicide is the second cause of death. Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region is actually the region of the United States that has the highest suicide rate for all ages. In the United States, every day there's an average of over 5,400 people, or people who attempt suicide, that are in grades 7 to 12. Not last year, almost 2 years ago, there was 1 week in which Douglas County alone, which is the county just south of the Denver metro area and just immediately south of my office where it's located, there were 14 suicides in 11 days. And during that same time period, there was at least 1 other teen suicide in the Denver metro area. Colorado is the 8th country in the nation for teen suicides. Among 50 states, Colorado is 8th, which means it's really up there. 4 out of 5 teens who attempt suicide have given clear warning signs, and we're going to talk about warning signs tonight. Another important statistic that actually doesn't just apply to Colorado, even though I've got it over on that side of the slide, is that 40% of suicide victims, people who complete suicide, have either alcohol or drugs or both in their blood at the time that they died. So that's a significant factor in suicide, and we'll talk more about that. The nature of suicide is an interesting phenomenon, and there is a whole field of study called suicidology by people who are studying this in order, of course, to prevent it. In the black box here is a suicide note. There is nothing for me here. I don't want to go on. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Please believe me. I love you all so very much, and I don't want to hurt you anymore. So this study that was done by Sanger and Peach in 2008 was a study in which they've read over 125 suicide notes left by people who did complete suicides. These are not suicide attempts. These are completed suicides. And it was a qualitative study where they were looking for trends and patterns and what can these suicide notes together tell us. So there were 7 things that they found that were consistent across most of these. These were the things that showed up most often in their study of these suicide notes and in their analysis of them. First, they gave instructions. Please give my Xbox to so-and-so. Please give my favorite outfit to this friend. Please do this with that. These, instructions for what to do with my things, whatever kind of instructions. There was reference to positive relationships. People who are survivors of suicide, family members, or friends of people who do suicide often assume that it means that there's bad relationships. There was reference to positive relationships often. There was also explanations about why they had committed suicide, just like this note that I just read. There's kind of a, there's nothing for me here, I don't want to go on kind of thing. And the last sentence in this note, I don't want to hurt you anymore. That implies that this person felt like they were causing pain to other people, and that was part of their reason, that they didn't want to do that and they didn't know how to not do that. In these suicide notes, there was reference to relationship reconciliation or maintenance. They were tending to the relationships that they had in the notes that they left, and they were concerned for others just like the person in this note. There was also mention of negative relationships and acknowledging the end of relationship, in a sense saying goodbye. So the 2 big takeaways from here is that the suicide notes considered both the positive and negative aspect of the relationships in their note, and the notes were an attempt to maintain and reconcile relationships even in the face of their death, and their death at their own hand, I would say. So this blows some of the myths that we have. Some of the myths that we have about suicide are that suicide is always about anger and revenge. They didn't find that at all in these suicide notes. It blows some of the other myths that it's only negative relationships that are going on and there's nothing good going on in these people's lives. This blows that myth to smithereens. So there's a bit about the nature of suicide. Let's talk about risk factors. Who is most prone to suicide? The number 1 thing is people who have previous suicide attempts. I'm going to skip to almost the bottom of the list here, the next to last item, exposure to others who have committed suicide. In that week or a week and a half where there was 4 students in one county that committed suicide, when I was preparing for this webinar and this presentation this afternoon, I reviewed many media articles and reports on this, and many of them mentioned the copycat effect and how when one person does this and other people hear about it, there is somewhat of a tendency for others who've been thinking about it, sitting on the fence, etc., to follow suit. So those are some of the biggest risk factors in suicide. Certainly psychological and mental disorders, including depression and mood disorders like bipolar disorder, other disorders like schizophrenia and social anxiety. And I apologize, this blue one somehow got made into a link, and so it shows up blue instead of white like the rest. And the same with substance abuse. It wasn't meant to be emphasized here on the screen. I'll refer back to the 40% of suicides, people who completed a suicide have alcohol or drugs in their system at the time. Those are huge risk factors in completing a suicide and or making suicide attempts. They lower the threshold of inhibition. They interfere with a person's cognitive function and ability to do critical thinking and problem solving. And they increase, of course, impulsivity. History of abuse or mistreatment, including bullying, is a risk factor. Family history of suicide, and there can be more than one factor there. Some of it is the biological piece, the tendency to depression and biologically based depression. And some of it also is more relationship-based and or the exposure to others who've committed suicide. If there's other people in the family who have, that increases the risk. Certainly feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, facing problems that the teen doesn't know how to solve is huge. There's almost always a sense of hopelessness in people who commit suicide. It's their last out, so to speak. Physical illness is also a big risk factor. Physical illness that is either life-threatening or chronic. And physical illness that causes distress or disability and that the person doesn't know how to cope with and feels hopeless about. High creativity quotient is another one. The research shows that high sensitivity, high intelligence, giftedness makes no difference in the incidence. There's neither more nor less percentage of gifted or sensitive youth that commit suicide or attempt suicide than the general population. However, creative people do have a higher incidence of suicide attempt and suicide completion. Another risk factor is impulsivity and or aggressive tendencies. Impulsivity is the act before you think phenomenon. And aggression is also another inner force that can just take over and carry a person forward before they think. Financial or social loss, breakups in romantic relationships are big with teens, or other friendships, difficulty in other friendships is also bigger for teens. For adults in suicide, when I was working on an inpatient psychiatric hospital unit and interviewing, doing the initial intake assessments on incoming patients, almost always there was some kind of a financial situation. A lawsuit of a financial nature that seemed hopeless, a loss of job, being laid off, being fired, being who knows what, all kinds of financial situations and dire financial straits were part of it, and financial situations that people felt helpless and hopeless in the face of that. Relationship loss, I've just talked about that. Isolation and lack of social support is huge. And many studies have shown how significant that one is in both teens and adults. easy access to the method or means of suicide. And different people use different means. Some are easy to access, some are difficult to access. Different people are prone to or open to using different kinds of things. So we'll come back to that more later. We've already talked about exposure to others who have committed suicide. This last one I think is huge. Feeling like they don't belong or having a perception that they are a burden to others. The suicide note that we read kind of had this sense of, I don't want to hurt you anymore. I don't want to be a bother, a burden. That person didn't use those words, but there was that sense about it. Many, many highly sensitive, highly creative, and or gifted people have sat in my office and talked to me about how they feel like an alien from a different planet and feel like they don't belong anywhere on this planet. And that is a huge risk factor. And that's one of the reasons that I really wanted to talk about this topic and share this topic beyond the local community, because that's a huge factor for highly creative, highly sensitive, and gifted teens. Here you see a picture of Graham Moore, and I don't know if you watched the Academy Awards last year. I rarely watch them. I don't follow Hollywood much. I just had a huge desire, a strong desire to watch them last year. And when I heard what Graham Moore had to say, I suddenly understood why. When he was 16 years old, he attempted suicide because he felt weird and different and like he didn't belong anywhere. And the essence of his message was, be weird. Be who you are, be whoever that is. Being weird, being different does not make you defective, does not make you inferior. And that's a message that I would like to get to every highly creative, highly sensitive, and or gifted teen and adult. You do belong. You are not a defective draft horse. You are a racehorse. And that's so important for each one of us to know. And, you know, I don't have it on the PowerPoints anywhere, but I have an article about that, about you are not defective, you are distinctive, you're different by design. And I will send that out to everybody on the call in case that's of interest, because I just think that's so important. But so suicide in the creative, sensitive, and gifted teens often has to do with them feeling weird, different, defective, inferior, feeling like they don't belong. High sensitivity has to do with a central nervous system that is both more perceptive and more reactive. And it also may have to do with a sensitivity emotionally. They may pick up on the emotions of other people. They may feel their own emotions more deeply, more intensely than other people do. So this heightened perception, being aware of things that just go right on by other people. They may hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Bright lights may bother them. They may hear other things that other people don't hear. They may pick up on subtle cues that other people just miss. They may pick up on the implications of things that have happened that go right by other people. All of this goes in together to create a situation of increased stress exposure and increased stress response. And by stress, I'm talking about the stress response in the body, the fight or flight response. The sympathetic nervous system that gets revved up, and the adrenals pump out adrenaline and cortisol and all these other biochemicals that get the body going. This group of people also has an increased speed of, it happens faster, the stress response does. It happens more intensely and more pervasively. As we grow and develop as human beings, babies come into the world. When they react with their whole body and their whole central nervous system. And as we grow and mature, our responses get more and more and more specific. So you can wiggle one finger, you can wink one eye, you don't just react to everything with your whole body. There's something about the central nervous system of highly creative, highly sensitive, and or gifted folks that our stress response is more pervasive. It's like it takes us over, whereas with other folks it may not do that. And then it lasts longer and comes back easier. All of that you would think would go into making a person more vulnerable to the stress response, more vulnerable to depression and anxiety and all of that. Because that thought doesn't carry out in terms of the research, except for the creative folks, I'm guessing that it's accompanied by greater problem-solving skills, greater critical thinking skills. And I'm not implying there that creative people don't have that. I think creative people have a whole different phenomenon to deal with. Stephen Presnall, in his books, The War of Art and Do the Work, attributes the phenomenon of resistance to this greater greater number of suicide attempts and completed suicides. That as soon as a creative person starts a creative project of any kind, there is a force of resistance that comes back against them. And that's what he attributes it to. I'm not sure it's that simple, but I think that's certainly a factor there. In creative, sensitive, gifted teens, when they're depressed, it's more likely to be existential depression. It's likely to have to do with the big questions in life. There may be the ordinary life things, but it may also be what's going on, what happened in France with the bombings, what happened in what happens in downtown Denver every winter with all the homeless people and the cold, and what do they do when they're homeless. It may have to do with who knows what, but the big issues in life, the existential issues, are more on the minds of creative, sensitive, and gifted teens. And when I talked about this afternoon in our live presentation, half of the parents that were there said, "Yep, you're exactly right. That's what bothers my teens, my highly sensitive teens. They're talking about issues that their peers aren't even thinking about. They aren't even on the radar for them." Another thing about creative, sensitive, and gifted teens is that they are able to carry out a more complex suicide plan than other kids are. And they are also able to carry out these horrific mass shootings, the Columbine High School massacre, the Arapahoe High School shooting, which happened last year, were all gifted teens, and those were homicide-suicide. The Aurora Theater shooting, which was just a homicide, was also a gifted youth. Not teen anymore. I think he was in his early 20s. But there's greater complexity often. So the characteristics of how they go about it is often more complex. So what are some of the warning signs that we need to be on the lookout for, that we need to pay attention to? And I would say any one of these is significant. The more of these that are going on, the more danger there is. So the one at the top of the list here, and these are really kind of in random order, there's no particular ranking. But when plans are made or attempts are made to secure the means for suicide. A teen who goes out and buys guns. And either the teens that have committed suicide with a gun and these homicide suicides with guns, either they used a false ID, and where did they get that? Or they were sold a gun even though they were a teenager, or some adult helped them, bought it for them. So adults have a great responsibility for keeping the means for suicide away from them. And if I had a teen in my household that I was concerned about suicide, I would lock up everything that they possibly could use. And Tylenol is often used, and I would lock that up too if I had a teen that I was seriously concerned about. Talking about suicide plans is huge. Again, from our very first slide or second slide, 4 out of 5 teens who do commit suicide have given clues about it ahead of time. And any talk about it needs to be paid attention to. Yes, there are teens who talk about, and adults, who talk about it and who make attempts as attention getters. And that it is helpful to separate that from those who are serious about it. But I would pass that part off to the mental health professionals. On the other hand, if the mental health professionals say, oh, this teen is fine, and your gut tells you otherwise, I would say follow your gut, always. Scratching, cutting, or marking the body. Now, a suicide attempt is not the only reason or purpose that teens have in mind when they do that, but that always needs to be ruled out. And again, if I had a teen that was doing any cutting, scratching, marking on their body, I would get them in therapy and get them assessed by a mental health professional. Any increase in risk-taking behaviors, running away, driving recklessly, riding a bike without a helmet, snowboarding, skiing without a helmet, doing other risky things. And some teens are sensation seekers and need to have a stimulated brain and do pretty strange, outlandish things in order to do this. What we're talking about here is an increase in risk-taking behavior. Something above and beyond the ordinary for this teen. This teen's ordinary. Alcohol and drug use. Now, many teens do drink, do use drugs. Many teens hide it or try to hide it. Many teens get their alcohol at home, and many teens get it elsewhere. That part, really, where they get it, really, I didn't see any statistics on that. But that 40% of completed suicides have alcohol or drugs in their blood at the time they died. That's very significant. Recently, there have come out recommendations for alcohol consumption. Just like there's a diabetic diet, just like there's a heart-friendly diet, well, there are now recommendations for healthy levels of alcohol use. And the healthy level of alcohol use or unprescribed drugs is none. A teen's brain and central nervous system is not fully developed, and so they are more impacted in the moment by both alcohol and drugs, and their critical thinking skills, their inhibition, their problem-solving skills are all inhibited when they're under the influence. So that's a huge one to be paying attention to. If you have a teen or know a teen and you know that there's alcohol or drug use, get them help, because it could cause not only in the moment problems, but it can cause lifelong problems for them. Then there's a kind of a whole list of changes that happen. Neglect of appearance, marked personality or behavior change, decline in the quality of schoolwork, a difference, not the same level. And then we're not talking about a kid who always struggles. We're talking about a kid whose school performance drops off. A giving away of possessions, if they're giving away not stuff that they don't need anymore, don't use anymore, have outgrown, that's not to be concerned about. The giving away things to be concerned about is giving away important things. If your kid gives away his Xbox or his 360 or stuff that's important to him or her, that's the part to be concerned about. Also to be concerned about is saying things like, I won't be here much longer. You won't have to deal with this anymore. You won't have to deal with me much longer. Stuff like that. Your coded, veiled allusions to death and to leaving. Those really need to be paid attention to. And then suddenly becoming cheerful after a long period of depression. What we want to think then is that, oh, they're finally better. All the work we've been doing has paid off. Well, maybe, and maybe not. Maybe they've just relieved their internal pressure by making a decision to end it all. And that needs to be checked out. That needs to be assessed very carefully. I skipped one on this list because persistent boredom, inability to concentrate can come from many sources. And so that does need to be assessed, and that may or may not have to do with suicide. It may have to do with ADD, ADHD, anxiety, many other kinds of things. Existential depression can look like that as well. Lots of different things can present in that way, and so that begs assessment. So there's risk factors, there's also protective factors. The protective getting my tongue tied here. Getting a teen who's at risk for suicide in mental health care and or substance abuse treatment. Getting treatment for that is a protective factor. Now, none of these are guarantees, but all of these are helpful, and the more of these that you have, the even more helpful they are. Restricted or limited access to the methods or means of suicide. If you've got guns in the house, lock them up. If you've got sleeping pills in the house, lock them up. If I was really concerned about a kid and their identified means would be pills, I'd lock up any kind of pills that could be used. And I think I already mentioned Tylenol. That's a huge one because that's easy to access. Family and community support is huge. And I included this photograph on the slide because pets are a huge protective factor as well. Support from medical and healthcare personnel is also important. And developing problem-solving skills and conflict resolution skills is really important and very helpful. And a religious and cultural belief that discourages suicide. If a teen feels like or thinks that if I kill myself, I'm going to hell, even if you don't believe it, I would not bust that myth at this point, if that's what it is in your perspective, because that can be a huge protective factor for them. If they're afraid of going to hell, that can keep them alive. And the movie Scared Straight was so popular because we can be scared into not just being straight, but we can be scared into staying alive. And I would make use of any and all protective factors and maximize all of these protective factors. So what if you're home with your teen, or you're at school with a teen, and there's nobody else around, and it's you and them, and you're trying to figure out, what do I do? Do I call 911? Do I not call 911? What do I do? So ask them straight out. And we are often, as adults, afraid to bring up these kinds of things. We're afraid that we will suggest something that will increase their chances of acting on it. The opposite is actually true. If you're thinking about it, most likely they are. It's already on their mind, and it's the elephant in the room. So talk about it and get direct. On a scale of 1 to 10, where are you? 1 is no thought of suicide. 10 is a completed suicide. Where are you on that spectrum? And once you ask the question, shut up, button your lip, don't say another word until they answer. And if they can't answer out loud, have them write it down. Have them draw it on your finger, on their hand. Draw it in sand or dirt or where, depending on where you are. But get them, if they're willing and if they're able, to tell you where are they on that scale. The follow-up question is, if that number goes up, what can you do to keep yourself safe? So now that you've asked those questions, now what do you do? Well, if the answer to number 1 is above 7, in other words, an 8 or above, get help now. If they're in therapy, call their therapist. If they're not in therapy, or if you can't get a hold of their therapist, either take them to the nearest emergency room or call 911. And if the answer to number 2 does not reveal a viable safety plan, if they don't tell you something that shows you that they have the ability to deal with increasing intensity of suicidal thoughts and urges, do the same thing. If they're in therapy, call their therapist. If they're not, get them a therapist, and I would put them on what in the field through the years we have called a suicide watch. You don't leave this kid alone 24/7. If you don't call 911 or take him to the emergency room, you don't leave him alone, and you don't let him have access to anything they could use. A third question you could ask is, if you did this, how would you do it? What means would you use? If they have a plan, that puts them at higher risk than if they don't. So what else to do? Take any suicidal thought or any suicide threat seriously. If you're really concerned, stay with your child or teen until you're sure that they're safe. Let other people know. You shouldn't be the only one who knows about this. If they're in therapy, report this situation to their psychotherapist and get them to help you with what needs to happen. If they're at school and you're the teacher, then get the counselor, the principal, or local law enforcement involved. And then there is a national crisis line. There's a safe to tell line and text a tip as well. And if there's an immediate threat, by all means, call 911. Now, what are some resources? I just mentioned a couple, and they're on here as well. And I will be posting this slideshow on SlideShare, so you can access it there. And I'll also be posting this webinar on YouTube, and you'll be able to access it there as well. But in Colorado, there's a 24-hour Colorado crisis support line here, and there's a national United States crisis line. A couple of them, and text a tip is here as well. After suicide attempt or suicide, in Colorado, there is a local nonprofit that's called the Second Wind Fund, and they provide support groups and other services for survivors of suicide. There is a website, SOS, Survivors of Suicide, that has a list of a national list of support groups, and there's the Alliance of Hope. And if you're out of the U.S., I would Google suicide resources in your area, because I'm sure that there are suicide resources in many places. All right, we have reached the end of our presentation, and I'm wondering if there's any specific questions, any specific comments that you would like to put in the chat window. I would love to answer any specific questions that anybody has. And if you, let me see if I can find a way. I know there's a way to unmute people so that maybe we can actually just have an audio conversation. Here's the audio. And oh, I'm just now seeing a note that there was no slide. I hope the slide has been up for you folks, and I apologize if it hasn't. Again, you'll be able to see the slide show on SlideShare and on YouTube. So feel free to type any questions or comments that you have. I appreciate your participation, and we'll be sending out a recording of this shortly when it gets ready. So if there's no questions coming in on the question or the chat panel, either one of those, then, because I'm not finding where to unmute the audience. So hopefully you can do it in the chat window if you have a question or a comment, either one. I hope this answered your questions, and appreciate your participation. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.